You're now live. Okay, we are live. This is Senate Finance, Wednesday, April 7th. And today we're continuing our work on the broadband bills and proposals. And we're going to hear from the communications union districts, get an update on their status. And we're going to start with Rob Fish. So Rob, welcome. And there you are. You moved up to the pink was. Okay, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, committee, for this opportunity to update you on the status of our communication union districts around the state. I have a short presentation that I will now attempt to share. So, technology, yes. So ideally right now you are,
there you go.
Now if I can find the controls, that's the question.
All right, now I've got to make the committee go away so I can see all of this. So committee, I can't see you, so just holler if you have a question.
Great. Well, for the record, my name is Rob Fish. I'm the Rural Broadband Technical Assistant Specialist with the Department of Public Service. For the past year and a half, I've been working with wonderful residents from around the state to create communication union districts. So you have seen some of these slides before, but there are updates, trust me. So you're still on this slide?
We're seeing slide number 1, yep.
Okay, now has it changed? I apologize.
Yeah, about 3 times. We're now seeing organized under Title 30.
Perfect. Great.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, the controls are different when I'm screen sharing.
So we understand that.
So as all of you know, communication union districts, they're similar to other type of municipal districts, such as solid waste districts, consolidated sewer districts. So I want to go through the growth of the CUDs. A lot has happened in the past year. So January 1st, 2020, these were the CUDs, EC Fiber and CV Fiber. Since then, town meeting day, we added 3 more. The summer. Now there are 9 districts, 165 member towns. There's 3 towns that are members of 2 different districts because they love it so much. There's another 44 towns in study areas, and those were areas designated through the Broadband Innovation Grants. There are probably about a dozen other towns right now that are in early discussions or some later discussions with various districts about joining them. So this is 333 board reps and alternates. Covers more than half of the state's population and 90% of the premises without access to 100 by 100 broadband. So once again, I'm the Rural Broadband Technical Specialist. I provide assistance to the CUDs, to towns. The department also provides assistance with broadband mapping. I mentioned the Broadband Innovation Grant. This has allowed now 7 of the 8 CUDs, I'm not counting EC Fiber here, have now completed their feasibility studies. We're expecting the results of that last one later this week. And I believe 2 of them have completed the business study and the rest are getting close. We also had some of the CARES Act funding, the COVID Response Connected Community Program. That was $2.3 million for recovery efforts, for recovery planning. So accomplished a lot of short-term projects, helped them update some of their plans, and it also allowed 2 CUDs that are in the process right now of constructing fiber to the home. Thank you again, H315. Thank you for that fire drill and making changes last week. We are working to be as flexible and as effective as possible. And those changes are quite welcome in allowing this pre-construction and capacity grant money, this 1.6 million, to go to CUDs, to go to their partners, or go to multiple CUDs. I believe that is back on the floor for you tomorrow. The CUDs are emailing me, texting me, calling me, writing me every single day asking for funds. So everyone will be very excited when that moves forward, ideally, and thank you. So one of the things that is going to likely fund is high-level network design. There's also poll studies and capacity things, but I want to just give you an example of some of the collaboration and creativity this is going to allow. On the left here, you have a map of various CUDs, and then you have the lines from Washington Electric Co-op. There's a burgeoning partnership between 3 CUDs and the co-op to build out and then lease the fiber to the CUD. So stuff is happening right now, which is exciting. The limiting factor, as usual, is funds, and I'm excited to see what happens when those funds get out the door to these groups. I also know that there's outstanding requests for proposals and plans for high-level design, poll studies, and operators even across the various CUDs. And I'm not going to go into too much detail since you're hearing from them later, but I encourage you to ask them about that. Northern Borders Regional Commission. Last time I was here, I told you about $1 million grant. That grant will likely be in joint fiscal very soon. We're expecting the obligation of federal funds, and we'll be very excited to get that out the door. It's for the cash contribution to help leverage VITA and other finance, and it's also going to provide more technical assistance in the form of what we're calling a broadband project developer. This will be somebody that has expertise in public-private partnerships and in leveraging capital and accessing capital. Also happy to announce that we found out very recently that we are also receiving some state capacity funds. This is going to be used for a single grant to a single CUD that is collaborating with a private partner to try to do something a little bit bigger. So this is our way to keep encouraging those conversations and to see what happens when more funding is provided. So this is new. We've also worked quite a bit with the Vermont Community Foundation during the pandemic. They've provided additional funds to the CUDs. They've supported the network of CUDs, VCUDA, general operating expenses. They provided grants to libraries across the state, working in collaboration with CUDs. And they are also doing this CUD Accelerator program. We want to get these communication union districts up to speed. So they went back to school. This was funded by the Community Foundation in partnership with Do Work co-working space. I encourage you to ask Evan Carlson about this. But this was a 9-week program, and this is what the agenda was for that program. We covered CUD structure, financing, state broadband policy, examples from around the country. We talked to the utilities. We talked to community broadband providers. These were sessions on Monday evenings throughout the last few months that on average, it was probably about 30 to 40 CUD board members attended. So these are committed volunteers, committed to learning, committed to doing. So what's next? I thought a question might come up of what about areas without CUDs? And I pulled up this map. It's once again a map of the CUDs, and what you see in green here are areas as of 2019 where there was already fiber built. You'll notice, except for the blue there, which is EC fiber, the areas where fiber is built, where there's 100 by 100 symmetrical service, do not have a communication union district, because those providers stepped up and have and continue to provide service. So the goal. Sure, go ahead. Sorry, Senator.
Which providers?
Oh, which providers? The gray area south of Rutland there, north. I wish I could point right now, but is VTEL primarily. The Chittenden County area, you have a Burlington Telecom. You also have Waitsfield Champlain Telecom as you move a little bit south, and then smaller efforts elsewhere in the state. You see Franklin Telephone way up there on the border.
Thank you.
So these groups are not interested in overbuilding existing fiber. They're interested in ensuring that there's universal service throughout all of their member communities. They're excited to partner with ISPs that share that commitment. I just want to make that clear, and most of these groups are in the process or are about to issue RFPs. They're in discussions of various levels. Some have non-disclosure agreements, some have just informal conversations. with providers across the state, utilities across the state, and even across the country. And they will likely speak to that when you talk to them later this afternoon. So I also wanted to show a map that shows the fiber in green and then the cable to once again make the point that where the CUDs have been organizing and pulling together are in many cases areas where there is no coverage, where we're talking about 4.1 DSL. A lot of the more denser urban areas have been built out with at least cable, and a lot of that will likely be converted to fiber. So in terms of just summing it up, there's at least 3 CUDs that are constructing fiber this year. That would be EC Fiber, CV Fiber, and NEK. They will all speak to those projects, and other CUDs will give an update of where they're at, because as I said, this is at least. They're all engaging actively with private ISPs and seeking partners, reviewing RFPs. And I wanted to end with just a few words that I've heard them describe, how they're describing themselves now, because the original EC Fiber model of building, owning, and operating, it's shifted now. Most of these groups see themselves as gatekeepers, as conduits, facilitators, accountability partners. Like their goal is to get it done and to ensure there's public accountability. So that is my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay.
I do have a question.
Sure.
Okay, Senator Brock, right up there. You're back.
And in terms of the evolving role that you see as CUDs, in which they're facilitators, gatekeepers, and a number of other terms that you use, in areas, particularly more urbanized areas, such as in Chittenden County, where there is heavy connectivity already among existing carriers, how would you expect the CUDs to interface with those carriers? And is there any incentive for those carriers, such as a Comcast, for example, to cooperate with CUDs? What's in it for them?
Thank you, Senator Brock. Well, as I showed on the map there, you're right. There is a lot of connectivity in Chittenden County. And I think that's one of the reasons so far where there is not a communication union district in those areas. Towns on the periphery, I'm aware, are in discussions with various CUDs. The Regional Planning Commission is also involved in discussions. So I think it's going to vary from area to area. Like another area that at this point does not have fiber is some of the TDS towns just south of EC Fiber. And I've talked with EC Fiber, and they're willing to be a conduit for funds if TDS is willing to build out universal service. So things are shifting in real time. It's exciting. It's a little bit stressful as we figure this all out, but the CUDs are interested in being partners. And I think in areas where a CUD, where there currently isn't a CUD, those towns may join a CUD, or those towns may work through the Regional Planning Commission. I think there's going to be a variety of different models to ensure that everybody is served.
Madam Chair,
the question is, are you going to have a situation in which you have either of non-cooperation of a legacy provider, and you have certain towns within that region in which the legacy provider is active? There will be locations also in which the service there is poor, or the legacy provider doesn't extend it. What does the CUD have the risk of, in effect, creating double coverage without a more clear governance model?
I don't believe any CUD is interested in overbuilding if fiber exists, and hopefully the threat of really, in many ways, the threat. This is where it's not just the carrot; it's also the stick of that. If you're not providing universal service to your area, that there might be a competitor that does that. From what I'm hearing from all the CUDs, they're more interested in being collaborators. Most of these people are not interested in necessarily creating or running a new ISP. They're interested in facilitating this service for their community. And I think one thing about the CUDs that's important to remember is the accountability side. These are volunteers. These are appointed by select boards in every single town. They're like, I could have done this whole presentation with a laundry list of stories of how people are suffering without coverage right now, that it came from the various CUDs. They're close to their communities, which is why they believe that they're in the place to provide the service and to provide the accountability and to provide the little push to encourage existing providers to upgrade.
And my last question is, what areas are now not covered by CUDs, and is there any plan to extend CUDs to those areas?
So the areas that are not covered by.
Thanks. Senator, as you may have read yesterday, the administration did release a plan that would include provisions for towns outside of CUDs. And I think what we have are many towns that are 80 or 90% served with a provider such as Comcast or Consolidated, where they are not in a CUD for that reason, that the state, through the granting authority, the VCBA or the VTA, whatever you establish, would be in charge of working directly with those towns to find a solution or do a connectivity initiative type solution for those towns. We would not expect the CUDs to be forced into carrying those towns, nor would we expect those towns or force those towns to become CUDs in order to take advantage of state funding.
Thank you.
Like, can I assume that was part of the governor's ARPA proposal?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
we've
we'll
made an
have you come in and give testimony on that. I think at
Yes.
another time, because that does need to be presented here. I've got Senator Hardy and then Senator McDonald. I think that's when I saw them. So Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Rob, thanks for this information. I love your maps in particular. We got some really interesting testimony yesterday that we weren't able to fully digest together about affordability and an affordability plan for people who are not able to afford the monthly service payments to access broadband. And I'm wondering what the CUDs are doing in that area to make sure that once it's built or connected, that people will actually be able to afford it.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Hardy. The CUDs universally agree that it's not just access, but it's also affordability, and it's also digital literacy of how to use these tools that are issues that need to be addressed. EC Fiber has actually helped create and fund a new organization that's looking at this issue. I know you had Holly come in and testify yesterday. The CUDs were also during COVID playing the role of providing community support, of providing in some ways the same role envisioned by the Broadband Corps. Several different CUDs created platforms and created a hotline where residents can call to help them get connected to service on a temporary or permanent basis, to locate Wi-Fi hotspots, or to figure out how to sign up for some of the subsidies that the larger providers offer. So the CUDs share that concern. I'm guessing you will hear more from them individually, but it is something they're very much involved in and recognized as an issue.
So that is part of their planning process,
I think
how to help people afford it.
It's something that's a concern for everybody. I think it's fair to say that it is part of their planning process of how that they can make their service more affordable.
Okay,
I
thank you.
think we will ask that, because one of my questions is, if the proposal we had yesterday, which would require that within X number of years, that a plan for no more than $25 a month is required. I would assume that for CUDs who represent a large portion of low-income people, that will have an impact on their financial planning. And I would like to hear from them as we move forward as to exactly what, because I think that was what they figured. I think it was actually $22. The figure was that they thought people could comfortably afford. So That's going to take us some time to work through.
Yeah, and I encourage especially EC Fiber is the one CUD that's providing service right now, and they did a lot during the pandemic, lot and continue to do during the pandemic to ensure that low-income Vermonters are connected and stay connected.
Okay, Senator McDonald.
We're dealing with three subjects here: construction, subsidizing hookups, and subsidizing paying for service. My question has to do with the construction and making the service available. And the answer to Senator Brock's first question, you gave an example of EC Fiber acting as a conduit with a facility with an entity I can't remember, but what was taking place in what you described?
So what I'm describing, and this is all very much in the early stages, because as you all know, the landscape is shifting and there's a lot of questions of what the landscape is going to be. But this was with conversations with FX Flynn will be testifying later, and the Regional Planning Commission. There are towns down there that are served by TDS. They're provided with DSL at various speeds at this point. TDS, if the funding is available, says that they're interested in upgrading everybody to fiber.
Who is interested?
Perkinsville and Ludlow Telephone, referring to, but they're part of TDS.
Are they private?
They're private ISPs.
Or cooperatives?
They're not cooperatives. I don't know. Go ahead, Clay.
An investor-owned incumbent local exchange carrier. They're a
Yes.
telephone company.
Okay, go ahead.
So, and those towns down there are looking at options right now of whether they're going to join a CUD, try to go it on their own. They're talking to individual providers and working through the process of figuring out what's best with their communities to ensure universal service. It very likely will involve those incumbent providers if they commit to providing universal service. And the CUD has no issues with if they have to, the way the at least 360 is written, they have to have some type of partnership, some type of agreement that's not defined, but the CUD's not going to stand in the way of that. If a provider is the way of funding getting to a provider that commits to universal 100 by 100 service.
Well, they private owned companies get their funding from their stockholders. So what are we talking about here when you say they're not, the CUDs are not opposed to what?
Opposed to having state funding or any of this federal funding go to a provider. Yes, these providers have the ability to call upon their stockholders and to build it out themselves.
But they don't build it out to places that are uneconomic. If we give them the citizens' tax dollar to build out, who will own the operation?
These are a lot of details that certainly need to be worked out, but accountability would be built in. I'm confident if EC Fiber is going to make such an agreement. Like that's the beauty of the CUDs of playing that role.
Madam Chair, I guess this has been very helpful. Who will work out these things? Will they be worked out according to rules and guidelines, or will they be ad hoc basis from this area to that area?
I think, Senator, that's a question for us. We will be writing the bill.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
until we know what the basis is, then we don't know how to go ahead. Thank you. Thank you.
I thought it was good to provide an example of where there are conversations that are happening, and there's new conversations happening every day. So think of it more collaboratively rather than competing necessarily.
But Madam Chair, we're dealing with businesses or operations that compete, and the investor-owned utilities are choosing not to build out into the countryside because it is not profitable, because they are responsible to their stockholders. So
Yes.
So that's the question we have to deal with. And if
Okay,
we
I
need to-
think
okay, we need
what
to know
I'm
what the guidelines
hearing
are. Thank you.
is that not everyone sees profitability as anathema. And
No,
that
it's not anathema at all.
no, that it made that the CUDs are understanding that in some spots, it may be more economical for towns to work with their present provider to upgrade. we will decide if we want that to happen.
Okay,
I think what they're saying is, and the first question is, are we here to promote CUDs? Or are we here to make sure that everybody gets high-speed, reliable broadband as quickly as possible?
well,
And that is a
those are
committee
apples and oranges.
decision,
Yeah.
which we haven't made.
Those are apples.
Okay,
Yeah. Okay, yep,
let's let the witnesses continue. All right, Rob, have you got, how far are you through your presentation?
I'm done with my presentation. I tried making
Okay.
that quick and leaving it open for questions. I know you have a
Any
lot on your
other
agenda today.
questions at this point? All right. I think if there are no questions for Rob at this point, we're going to go to Commissioner Tierney. Because we had asked her to come in and review the House bill, and then it was also requested that she review S18, which is Senator Brock's bill, and kind of give us her perspective on those bills from her position. Or we've got one bill and one proposal, and then we had another proposal from Mr. Evslin yesterday. And then I understand there is a governor's proposal, which I'm not sure what that is at this point. I know there are some broadband proposals in the governor's proposed ARPA bill that was released yesterday. But I read those over in summary at 5 o'clock last night, and I will not tell you I retained all of them in detail. So Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very nice to be here again, and I can speak to all of those topics. I think we have a limited amount of time, so please feel free to have me back if that will be useful to the committee. I thought what I would do is go through the excellent overview that Maria Royal gave yesterday, the side-by-side, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen if Faith will help me with that, and simply call that up, the document that Maria used, and try to hit the highlights there. And then I have some observations about the testimony that you heard yesterday from Holly Groschner and Chris Campbell, two individuals I know very well and with whom I've worked over the years and have great regard for. And I'm happy, if time allows, to also speak a little bit to the proposal that Mr. Evslin was previewing with you. And then last but not least, Madam Chair, or maybe if you prefer, I can start with clearing up the governor's proposal and how it relates to your
To
committee's
give
work.
us the governor's proposal, and then we have
Sure.
all the proposals on the table.
Fair
So
enough.
we know what we're going to mix and match or
And I
add
am well
something
aware,
else.
folks are so very busy, including yourself, Madam Chair. I did try to reach you, I think on Monday. or
I
Tuesday.
did, and I did call you back, but it was,
You have a life too.
well, it
And
was late in the day.
had I reached you, I would have given you the preview that I gave to the House Energy Technology folks as well. In essence, what the governor has done is taken the ARPA money, and he has put forward a vision as to how he thinks it would be best used in the state. And I'm not going to take responsibility or charge of conveying how that vision is going to be layered into the ongoing budget discussions that are being had in the legislature right now. Instead, what I'm going to do is just explain that the connectivity piece is, if I remember correctly, is the largest bucket of the buckets that he's identified. It's $250.5 million that is basically appropriated to three different areas. One is broadband build out. The other is a much smaller project, but essential for the Northeast Kingdom to maintain the Fiber Connect network that was deployed with the help of Gates Foundation money in 2010. It's a small circuit that services libraries and schools and the like in the Northeast Kingdom that people really depend on, and it needs to be shored up until such time as better connectivity is available. And then the last piece is what I call the telecom plan implementation fund, and that's a $25 million bucket, anticipating that there will be strategies or recommendations from the telecom plan to be delivered in June of this year that would require funding. And I'm thinking principally about measures that would be directed at enhancing cell service in the state. On the $225 million broadband spend, what the governor has in mind is agnostic at the moment as to whether H360 or I think it's 118, ultimately is passed. In other words, it's designed to be plug and play. Third option, of course, is also that the existing Department of Public Service would administer the money unless and until a different vehicle is stood up. In any case, the idea is to empower the CUDs with this money, and it contemplates that the CUDs would either build their own networks, or they will partner with incumbent service providers and the like to get a network build done. The objective is is universal broadband, and the strategy for achieving universal broadband is if there is an address that has 25.3 or less at this point in time, those are the addresses that are prioritized to receive 100 up, 100 down symmetrical fiber to the premises build. So basically those who right now are in the lower end of connectivity in the state leapfrog to the higher end of connectivity in the state using this money. The department has estimated that how much each CUD would receive based on pro rata appropriation of funding to their service territories that is tied to the number of underserved or unserved addresses that they have. And there's a chart that was available in the materials that the governor's office released that detailed how much each CUD would receive. I can't recall it off the top of my head right now, but we are talking substantial sums of money, multiple millions of dollars to each CUD.
Can you get us a copy of that, of the
I'll be glad.
governor's, that
Yes,
proposal and that
Yes.
map or any supporting documents? That would be very helpful.
I would be glad to do that, Madam Chair.
Okay.
But that is essentially the overview of the governor's proposal. It's very much in line, I think, with the conversation that the legislature's been having about what we should do with substantial federal funding. And it is also very much in line with the work that the department has been doing since last year in anticipation of this federal funding. I recall telling you last spring when the pandemic first started that we would be ready with a plan should we receive federal funding, and the governor's proposal reflects that. So that's all I would give you at this time. Would you like me to proceed to the H360 S118 contrast, or would you like me to take questions?
Are there any questions at this point about the governor's plan? We will get the documentation. I think this came out yesterday.
Yes.
I heard about it around 5 o'clock. So, Senator McDonald.
When it comes to the construction aspect of providing 100 symmetrical, what direction does the governor's plan take?
The governor's plan contemplates that there will either be a CUD that is doing that construction, or that there will be a CUD in partnership with an incumbent service provider or an electric utility or the like to do that construction.
And will the incumbent provider construct that with the incumbent provider's capital resources?
If that is the agreement that the CUD reaches, I suppose so, yes.
Okay. And if it is with tax dollars, would we expect a different agreement to be reached?
No, that's exactly the purpose of the tax dollars. It's to capitalize the CUDs so that
No.
they can do that work in partnership with the the internet service provider. Now, the internet service provider may choose to invest their own capital dollars, but I tend to agree with you, Senator McDonald, that the track record to date has been that they do not. They've at least not done so, if the idea has been that exclusively their own capital dollars would be used. But that's the whole point. We're talking about substantial funding, and my observation over the years would be that when substantial funding is available, people who might have been sitting on the sidelines before find themselves getting engaged.
Indeed. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner, I'm not seeing any other questions, so we're back to you.
So I think we're, I hope, going back to the shared screen, Faith, because I think we're going to start that commentary that I was going to do on the contrasting that that Maria Royal did. So if we could get that document back, I'll start on that.
Commissioner Tierney, are you sharing your screen or asking me to share mine?
Forgive me, this is my maladroit approach here. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully I've got this lined up properly. There we go.
Okay, terrific, thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Faith. Appreciate that pointer. My comments in contrasting these two proposals go to the scope of the mission, who directs and control, and who has control over the body that directs this mission. It goes to a degree of funding, and also some of the transitional responsibilities that the department would have. And then finally, I'd like to speak to this question that Senator McDonald and I were just touching on, which is the relationship between CUDs and other actors in getting this bill done. Turning first to scope, as you can see on this page, Maria is very...
Commissioner Tierney, they can't see your screen yet.
Not up.
Okay, my apologies. Let's see if I can figure out how to change that. Otherwise, Faith, if you're able to just pull up...
I don't
Maria's
have it
document,
prepared, but I'm happy to get it.
that might be the better way to do it, because I've done everything I know to do on my end to share my screen.
There we go.
We got it now?
Something's going. There we go.
Okay.
And just walk me through where you are.
Thank you so much. Question for you, Faith or Madam Chair. Can you see my cursor moving around Universal Community right now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Then I have control of that. So Faith, I'm on page 1 right now. This goes to scope, as Maria Royal has very correctly pointed out. There are two different philosophies here at work. 360 has a much more targeted scope. It's directed at achieving universal broadband, and it has a specific vehicle in mind, the Vermont Community Broadband Authority. S118 has a much more expansive mandate in mind, and it looks to me like this is mostly to take a variety of functions presently performed by the department out of the department. Most of them look like they are jurisdictional to services that the department does not have regulatory jurisdiction over. And so there's some logic behind that. And what I heard from Ms. Groshner and Mr. Campbell yesterday very clearly was that focus is at a premium. If you're going to have targeted results, and if you're going to achieve your objectives such as universal broadband, you are going to want to have sharp mission focus. And in that sense, I think H360 does that job in that manner. Many of the functions that are lifted out of the department under S118 are things that the department can do and has done. I suspect that if we did not have the burden of also trying to be the broadband facilitator and coordinator and the like, that we would have a better shot at devoting our resources to these other functions. I would have to say mobile telecommunication service, I agree completely with Chris Campbell's assessment that that is even more difficult to work on in the rural context than broadband is. So I think the bottom line here is if we want to get 25.3 and below addresses served with 100 up, 100 down fiber connections using the money that we have available to us from the federal government, we need to have a focused mission. And frankly, I've just come from a roundtable with all of our federal legislative leaders and the governor and also our state legislative leaders. And Senator Leahy was very clear that that needs to be the priority of this money, is to get broadband out now to people. Moving down to the bottom part of the screen, we have two descriptions of what the controlling board would look like. We have a 7-member board and a 9-member board. I will tell you candidly, I think both are too big. I think what we are doing here in both bills is replicating the conversation that you're having in the legislature, and that is proving very difficult. I know sitting in my seat at the department, there are so many legislators who've made it abundantly clear to me that from their point of view, the only thing the state should be doing is building 100 up, 100 down fiber to the premises. And indeed, that is the goal that is articulated in our statutes. I have also been inundated with contacts from legislators and private citizens who are desperate to get 25.3 cable connections so that they can get broadband service. And that is an entirely lawful activity in the state. There is substantial private capital that is devoted to that. Substantial networks in the state already exist. And as we saw through the very successful line extension program during the pandemic, there is considerable demand for extensions of that system. My point in contrasting the two is simply to say that statutes as presently written do not resolve that dichotomy. And creating a board of this nature is likely to perpetuate the dynamics, perhaps not the topic, because both pieces of statute are very clearly focused on strictly fiber buildouts. But when you have representation from the industry, Faith, if you could go, for instance, to the next page, please. For instance, under S118, you have a member of VCUDA, VCUDA, representing the CUDs, and you have a member of the Telephone Association, and you have a member appointed by the Senate, a member appointed by the House. You are replicating the multiplicity of perspectives around a topic that has not been clearly resolved in law. And so those folks are going to be on that board fighting each other, or fighting is a very strong word, vigorously debating with each other when the appointed mission is to get broadband built. So what I would recommend that you do is I would make this board smaller. I also know that many of you are very interested in accountability, and I've done the math on both of these, whether it's 7 or 9 representatives. Either way, the governor does not have control of this board, and that may be the objective, and I can certainly respect that, but it also means that he doesn't have the accountability because he does not control these boards. And that, my understanding is, was one of the principal objections and ultimately reasons why he was decommissioned. Because the simple premise was, if you're going to hold the governor accountable for getting this mission done, then you also need to give him the ability to control who's doing it. So what I would recommend you do is shrink this board. I have seen 5-member boards work efficiently. I've seen 3-member boards work efficiently. And I would instead, from your perspective as legislators, rely on providing legislative guidance that is clear as to what you expect this board to achieve. And then secondly, I would rely on a very robust reporting mechanism such that you had during the CRF funding, where the department filed reports with you on a monthly basis. I believe we also filed them with the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate, and also with Joint Fiscal and with JITALC, the Joint Information Technology Oversight Committee. And those mechanisms, I think, proved very, very successful in making sure that legislative input and legislative checks were exercised on the actions that the department was taking in executing on the CRF funding. Looking at the qualifications, I think both bills have excellent ideas about qualifications. one caution I would give you is that Vermont's a small state and we rely a great deal on volunteers. And this is a professional job that we are looking to get done. And it is a tall order to find people with these qualifications in the very short period of time that is allowed under H360. I believe, I may be mistaken, but I think S118 is silent on how long we have to put this board together. It can take a long time to find people with these qualifications to agree to do this very valuable work for basically what's the word called? Per diem stipends. I did note that in S118, the chair serves as CEO of the organization and is to receive the salary of the same as a judge. And I did share with Senator Brock that I thought that was a commendable thing to do. And by industry standards, that is a very small salary. So, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. My understanding again is that one of the problems that bedeviled the VTA was that the cost of staffing was greater than the legislature could justify given what the VTA had produced in its 7 years. On the other hand, as I understood, and I was not there, so you should not take my word for it. You should ask folks who were there. But what I understand is that it was felt at the VTA that they were needing to pay a premium for salaries in order to get the kind of talent that you need to do the kind of work they were doing. So that would be something to examine further. I would also observe, as somebody who has a background in personnel, in addition to running my own agency, the VTA was in place for 7 years, if I'm not mistaken, and there were 3 executive directors during that time, which strongly suggests to me that the position was not one that lent itself to constancy in leadership, meaning people could not or would not stay in that position in order to execute on this mission. I do not know why, but I think that's something that you may want to look into. If we could go to the next page, Faith. Notably on this side over in H360, the House bill has a specific funding stream for the entity that the VCBA. And I think this is very prudent and something that the legislature needs to be mindful of, as you always are. And this returns us to, the dynamics we generally have about having too many needs and too few dollars. We now have substantial federal funding available to us. And if you combine that with a limited period of time for this mission to get done, I think you can carve out the requisite administrative funding from the federal dollars in order to provide this entity with the support it needs. It makes sense to have targeted the 0.4% of revenue from the universal service charge because that is the same increment that you authorized in 2019 in order to augment the connectivity initiative, which at that time was the only program Vermont had for building out broadband. You will recall, though, that earlier in this session, we've had conversations about how to pay for E911, and the Universal Service Fund is under considerable pressure. So if you were to take this 0.4 increment, if memory serves, you're talking about a recurring $800,000 to $1 million a year. You may want to talk to folks who are at the VTA to find out whether that would have been a sufficiently robust budget. Later in this comparison, we will find that both bills contemplate that the entity will have the power to retain its own experts, employees, et cetera. And I think that is very good. You need to make sure they have enough money for that. And you need to make sure that you're clear about who controls that budget. Is it the governor? Does the entity have to go through the executive branch budgeting process and reflect the governor's priorities? Or do you have in mind an entity that has more independence, such as the Public Utility Commission or the E911 board? I frankly don't know which to recommend to you. I have lived in both realms, and I can tell you that in both realms, they never have enough money. But that is something you need to be clear about because it will influence how the board conducts its business or how the entity conducts its business
Madam-
especially among the decision makers.
Madam Chair, can we ask questions as we go, or do you want to wait?
Yes, Senator Sarakin.
So you mentioned that there could be plenty of money from the ARPA funds. Are you suggesting that we leave the universal service charge alone and just take the administrative dollars from the ARPA funds? And is that permissible under ARPA?
Thank you very much, Senator Sarakin. So yes, that is what I'm suggesting. And with a caveat, we don't yet have the Treasury regulations that tell us how the ARPA money can be used. I am assuming that, as is typical with such programs or such funding, there's an increment. Sometimes it's 2%, 5%, or 10% that is expressly reserved for administrative costs. And that was certainly part of the governor's package.
Thank you.
And I believe yesterday, Chris Campbell suggested that we don't look at this in a 3-year or 5-year beginning and end, but that as technologies change, we're going to need an ongoing department, whatever, that is responsible for communications technology. But
Yes, with that, Madam Chair, you've anticipated one of the points I was going to make, which is that I appreciate that both bills include a sunset provision. I think both were directed at addressing one of the governor's concerns, which is that he does not favor expanding government. And I think having a sunset on it is a provision that gives him comfort. But I too have been mindful of the testimony that I've heard twice now from Holly Rochner and Chris Campbell about the depressive effect that the sunset provision has on this kind of work. Because it's one thing to stand the facilities up, but they do have ongoing needs and that they need to be administered. And the CUDs certainly would have some of that responsibility. But in the context of S118, for instance, going back to this large scope that's envisioned, many of those duties are things that the department does on that ongoing basis and that survive a 2026 or 2029 sunset. So there's a tension there that needs to be resolved, and that would become an argument for keeping a more focused scope and just making the entity deal with broadband build out. Returning back to the contrast here, let me see where I am in my notes. Forgive me. I noted that in 8.4, I think it is 8084. I wonder if we could go down just a little farther there. Thank you. That's perfect, Faith. Oh no, it comes later, but I'll deal with the problem now. I think that Faith, forgive me if we could go back just a little bit to page 3. There we go. What you have here is in 360, the express mandate to facilitate partnerships between CUDs and communications providers and electric utilities. And on the other side, what you have is an entity that is looks to me like it is more open to facilitating partnerships and collaborations between state entities, nonprofits, munis, federal government, and the private sector. So both have the idea in mind that the entity will be working in partnership with other actors in this field. I did listen very carefully to Holly's testimony about her unease of having CUDs forced into partnerships, if you will, with ISPs. And I've reflected a great deal on that point because I think that is probably the principal tension that we are trying to address in both bills. Should we just be CUD centric, or should we be focused on CUDs partnering with ISPs, or should we be open to any comer who wants to work on broadband, as Chris Campbell suggested, for instance? And where I come down on this topic is a couple things. For one, we have thanks to Congress, 30 years of looking to the market to solve the last mile problem, and that didn't work. Vermont took matters into its own hands in 2007 and stood up the VTA. And 7 years afterwards, notwithstanding some excellent work that was done, the last mile problem still was not solved. This legislature has devoted substantial time and effort in recent years to standing up the CUD scheme, statutory schemes. What I mean by that, you have worked your way there incrementally, beginning with creating the statute that enabled CUDs, giving them substantial resources in 2019 to do planning, and also providing a specific resource at the department to work as a counterparty and coordinator in fostering their growth. And then, of course, the substantial resources that you made available in Act 137 last year so that the CUDs could accelerate their deployment through recovery planning. In preparing for this testimony, I looked at Act 79 again, and I was struck by the following finding. The legislature found that reaching the last mile will require a grassroots approach that is founded on input from and support of local communities whose residents are best situated to decide which broadband solution fits their needs. And then it goes on at length about other things that CUDs need and why you are supporting them. That combined set of facts that I just gave you suggests to me that the legislature needs to stand behind the CUDs in full. And as much as I appreciate the discomfort that Ms. Groschner was articulating, I think that I'm willing to be optimistic that the CUDs can get this job done, whether it's by working on their own networks or working in partnership with ISPs. There's a very successful example of this in Massachusetts, where the legislature took substantial money, appropriated substantial amounts to each town in the state, and left them the option to decide whether they would build their own networks or partner with an ISP or another provider such as Charter or Comcast. And they're very pleased with the results that they achieved. I don't believe that that strategy was a fiber focused strategy. So that is a modification that we would need to make in Vermont, but still it's a model that can work. And I think it's one that needs to be tried in Vermont because the other incremental steps that we've taken in the past have not succeeded. With that said, I think there has to be a way to show or to give some leeway for our incumbent service providers like our incumbent telephone exchanges who have service territories where they have been deploying fiber, admittedly at their pace, and as they have responded to customer cues as to what customer demand is. I just don't see the need to leave them out in the cold entirely. And this is testimony that I gave in House Energy Technology when they were devising H360. And I was very pleased to see that the bill evolved such that it contemplated, as you see here on the screen, facilitating partnerships between CUDs and communications providers. As I understand it, one of the concerns that the smaller telcos have and smaller providers have is that they would like the ability to be joined in this effort using this funding without having to partner with a CUD. And that is one of the tensions that you are going to have to resolve. And from my clinical point of view, I think that that is not what you should be doing. You need to make this stick. You need to empower the CUDs, and you need to make clear that partnership can be any variety of arrangements, anywhere from the incumbent service provider acting as a vendor, which is what Ms. Groschner suggested, and possibly a model where the CUD is providing that critical local community input that you're finding in Act 79 contemplated. But I think that needs to be the price of participating in the use of this funding. That said, I have to tell you that when I was at this roundtable just a moment ago, I thought I heard Senator Leahy saying very clearly that that from Washington's perspective, there needs to be some accommodation and some understanding of the role that these local providers play, and that they should, they should be welcomed into this process. And that would be consistent with what Chris Campbell was saying yesterday. If we could go to the next page, please. I'll be right with you. Hang on. 4439. Okay. We've now come to the part where Ms. Royal was underlining the features that are unique. So I will try again to sort of surf the high tops here. Just to flag something that is near and dear to lawyers toward the very bottom here. This S118 correctly anticipates that the board that is stood up is going to need to govern itself, and it's going to need to have standards and rules and the like that are transparent, and that the public can see and frankly give feedback on as to whether they think that works or not for their needs. I would recommend, though, that you go beyond rules and also permit them to work by devising policies. That is a piece of wisdom, if you will, that emerges from my many years of legal practice, where I can tell you that adopting a rule is an intense legal process that Senator McDonald is very familiar with. And you do not want your executive committee to be caught up in the intricacies of the Administrative Procedures Act, where they have to go through formal rulemaking in order to get their policies stood up. So I would definitely pay attention to that and make sure that they've got the greater flexibility of being able to govern themselves through stated published policies. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay. I think we might have gone just a little beyond where I wanted to go. Faith, if you could go back. There we go. Thank you. At the bottom here, both bills contemplate a trade secrets exemption from the Public Records Act. I was very struck by Holly Groshner's testimony yesterday, where she commendably called out the value of having folks who take public dollars do their business out in the open. And that is a value that I share with her. However, that said, we are contemplating that entities like CUDs will enter into a competitive landscape. And I believe this committee has heard me say before that when you contemplate such a mission, you have to level the playing field for those folks. If they're going to be in a landscape where they are providing last mile service, admittedly service that competitors did not want to provide, but once that infrastructure is built, you have a whole different story. My point here is that the CUDs need to be able to develop their business plans and the like without having those documents be discoverable or subject to Public Records Act requests in real time. To the extent that that makes folks uncomfortable, I think the middle ground here lies in putting a time frame or a time limit around such an exemption, so that, for instance, you could have them exempt for a period of 3 years, so that you still have public scrutiny that is possible, visibility into what the CUD is doing, but it's not in a manner or at a pace that becomes obstructive or harmful to their ability to actually formulate their business plans and do their analyses with other stakeholders. Now we can go to, I think, the next page here. I'm thinking, well, actually, I've already covered what was on page 5. So if we could go to page 6, please. There we go. I thought it was wonderful that both bills contemplate the use of grants and loans and debt and financial instruments. This is absolutely critical. And I think you have a lot of commonality. S118, I think, is a little more specific on this, and there's a lot of good thinking that went into what's detailed here. So that if I had my druthers, I would probably merge the two here and make sure that the language in S118 is carried forward under section 8085. The item immediately below, the broadband core, in principle, I think this is a great idea. This goes to the Epsilon presentation of yesterday. This is an item that was identified in the emergency broadband or telecommunications plan, which is different from the emergency broadband action plan. So let me start back up again. Under Act 137, the legislature authorized $500,000 for an emergency telecommunications plan that was delivered in December of 2020. One of the items that was identified in that plan was the creation of this broadband core, because it does recognize the serious problems that are posed by illiteracy in technology and also affordability in terms of getting the requisite gear that you need in order to actually make use of your broadband connection. This is an issue that Senator Brock has identified as well, and that he and I have had an exchange about. And this is a question of timing and funding. And from the governor's perspective, you will see when you get those materials for his ARPA proposal, there is no component in that proposal that expressly calls out the work that the broadband core would do. This is not because that conversation has not been had with the governor, and it's not because this is an issue he does not care about. Rather, it is a reflection of his view that the ARPA dollars need to be used for infrastructure, for capital investment, and that this issue of how to get people literate about technology, how to make sure that they have equipment that will allow them to actually use their internet connection and to afford it, that those are pressing issues that need to be dealt with, but not by using the ARPA money. So I endorse this concept, and I have worked very productively with the Evslins in helping them to understand the limitations of what the department can and cannot do right now. And I would encourage a further discussion on this point, but I am not clear that this is something that you want to put on the entity that you are going to stand up if you do that, whether it's under 360 or S118, because again, it goes to scope of the mission. I think the scope here needs to be getting infrastructure built so that people have access universally in the state. And by access, I mean access to infrastructure for high-speed broadband. If we could go to the next page, please. Very briefly on this point, I just want to make a plea for mercy. Earlier in my presentation, I flagged that reporting is a mechanism that the legislature uses very effectively in order to monitor the activities of the agencies that implement your programs. Quarterly reporting is probably essential here, but it is going to be burdensome, frankly. And so there is a custom, I think, of setting January 15 as the reporting deadline for these reports, especially the annual ones. I would ask that you turn that to say January 30 instead, because it's over the years, it's just been a very, very difficult lift for our agency to meet the January 15 deadline. And I would expect that that would prove the same for any entity that you stand up as well. Sunsets we've already discussed, so I'm just going to pass over that. Turning to page 8. Going down to the item dealing with fiber. The department's view on this is very simply that owning fiber circuits was never native to the department's mission. This is something that we received as a function of the decommissioning of the VTA, and I think it is time that those assets were placed back with entities that can make the use of them for which those assets were built. And that to me logically is the CUDs. And I suppose that the VTA, the new version, could make use of them as well. So give them to somebody, but don't leave them with the department. If you do leave them with the department, just understand that we do have somebody on staff who's got outstanding credentials to continue administering those assets if need be. The proposal at the bottom to move connectivity initiative away from the department to be administered by the either entity. I think that that is a logical companion piece. If you're going to stand up another entity, then yes, they should take over that initiative as well. Going next to page 9, please. Just looking at the effective date, S118 contemplates that the department, that the statute will take effect immediately, and that the connectivity initiative then would be immediately administered by the VTA, whereas under H360, there's a lag time. I think that the H360 approach is preferable because the VTA is just not going to be able to administer their program from the get-go. To the extent that there's concern about whether the department would take the intervening time to administer the program in a way that is inconsistent with legislative priorities, apart from the fact that that is not my style. I would suggest that if that is the concern, that you simply adopt language that puts that program in abeyance until January 1st, 2022. As it is, I've been holding that program in abeyance because I've been mindful of the fact that we have this problem with funding for E911, and that you may need to use the existing connectivity initiative dollars for purposes of ironing out their financial difficulties this year. The S118 contemplates repealing the Telecom Connectivity Advisory Board. H360 envisions that it will no longer review connectivity initiative proposals, but that it would continue with its other responsibilities, which are matters such as advising the department on the content of the telecom plan. I have to tell you, I think the TCAB has had its difficulties, but I think in the last year in particular, they have been stepping up and have been able to provide the input that you have contemplated. I appreciate the clarity of simply repealing them if you've got a VTA that is constituted to do largely what the TCAP otherwise would do. But if you were to keep the body in place, as H360 contemplates, my point is I think they have picked up steam, and frankly, I have benefited as commissioner from the advice I've been getting from them. Next page. I've covered the trade secret piece going down to the very bottom of the page. I don't have firm views on this matter. I will admit that I have at times thought about whether one of the ways to encourage build out would be to provide some sort of tax exemption for individuals, they claiming a tax credit for building a line or something like that. But this is clearly not my area of expertise, and so I would urge you to bring in the tax department to speak to what the implications of this exemption would be. From a policy perspective, I think anything that helps or that promotes the deployment of broadband and makes it more affordable or creates an incentive for deployment is a good thing. And so it's an idea that warrants serious consideration. Going to the next page. All the way at the bottom, I think that the broadband occupational needs survey is an excellent step that I would highly recommend be enacted. If we could go to the next two pages, the next page. I would make the same observation about the incumbent training program and the broadband installer apprenticeship program. These workforce needs are things that the department identified in the emergency broadband action plan last year. And this is an excellent step toward implementation and one that I recommend. The study on the VTA bonding authority, my memory is that the department performed an analysis of that nature a couple of years ago. I think that this subject merits further study, and especially from a different perspective to see what their take is on it. So I would definitely recommend that. Turning to page 13, I think we have in principle already covered the funding piece. It's just useful to recognize that when H360 first was getting underway, the dollars that were on the table were the one-time money that had been identified from the general fund. And the governor had proposed a $20 million spend on broadband. In the interim, in anticipation of the APRA funding, it looks to me like on the H360 side, the expectations of that funding found their way into their legislative proposal. And I think that these sums all look reasonable to me. I would note that the governor has since proposed spending $225 million on broadband connectivity issues, or $250.5 million, but specifically $225 million for broadband. Whether parts of that money would be spent on activities like the Department of Labor and the construction grant and subordinated debt program is something that you would need to decide. The governor's proposal was more simple, which was that we would appropriate money to each CUD territory, depending on the number of unserved and unserved addresses that they have, to make the fiber build. So this is what's in H360 is more programmatic in nature. The governor in general does not favor programmatic spending with ARPA dollars. However, I think you could probably use some general fund dollars if you can secure them for these activities. To cut to the chase on it, what's in H360, these are good activities, but if the objective is to maximize the use of these ARPA dollars to get universal broadband out there, then you want to focus on spending them on construction and not so much on these activities. However, I think I've just contradicted myself because I did a moment ago tell you that I felt the workforce development activities were good ones, and it looks to me like some of these funding items support those activities. So from a clinical perspective, it's a smart thing to do. But from the Scott administration's perspective, the focus needs to be on infrastructure build out. Last but not least, I see here that you
Madam Chair, could I ask?
Senator Hardy. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Tierney. Sorry to interrupt you.
Not
I did have a question about and I, realize that you're just simply relaying the governor's position in this, but we do, the ARPA money isn't specifically for infrastructure money, infrastructure projects. Is for a whole host of things with a fair bit, hopefully, of flexibility. There is another pending, hopefully, legislation that is specific to infrastructure. So that is hopefully coming down the pike, that is really all about building stuff. So I'm wondering why the insistence that ARPA money be just used for infrastructure, and couldn't we get a bigger bang for our buck if we used it for infrastructure plus training plus services plus other things?
It's the best part of this is that we can actually have this debate because there's actually money
Sure.
available.
There's a lot of money on the table.
Right. So with that said, a couple of things. I'm sure you're aware that the Senate parliamentarian just ruled this week that the budget adjustment process could be used in the U.S. Senate more than once. And so within just this last week, the odds of that infrastructure bill actually passing at the federal level have increased significantly. But still, there is a significant risk that that legislation will not come to pass. President Trump spent 4 years telling us that there would be an infrastructure bill, and there never was. So from the governor's perspective, and I'm not speaking for him on making those observations, I'm providing that as background for my own, but I am speaking for him here. From the governor's perspective, the insistence on infrastructure is he wants to make sure this money gets invested in a manner that will pay the long-term dividend. There has been a sore underinvestment in infrastructure because we've not had the means, and these dollars are basically the bird in hand. And there are other ways to meet programmatic needs. And that's a different conversation from his perspective. And out of respect for you, Senator Hardy, I'm going to concede that there are other perspectives. And that is the joy of the legislative debate.
Yes, well,
That is-
thank you for that,
That is the
Commissioner.
governor's.
I understand and I agree that there are lots of infrastructure needs, including broadband, of course, but we do get long-term impact and benefits from workforce training and education and healthcare and other things as well. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And
Senator-
oh, go ahead, please.
I'm watching the clock.
Yes.
And Senator Bray has his hand up, and then I think you're about finished, right?
Almost. I just have some observations about staffing to make, but
Right,
yes.
okay. So Senator Bray.
You're on mute.
As we are short on time, I'll be really brief. And just to say that I share Senator Hardy's concern. You know, when I read the American Rescue Plan Act, it's a COVID response bill. And then I read the entirely different American Jobs Plan, which is due to be out in October, and that's an infrastructure bill. And the governor's chosen a name that is somewhere in between, the American Recovery Plan, so I'm not sure what he's referring to precisely. I think it's still the American Rescue Plan, but I don't know how many of these proposals would be properly attributed to a COVID response. And I guess we'll be watching what Treasury delivers for guidance in the next 45 days to figure that one out. But
No, it's a very interesting observation, Senator Bray. A couple things. It's not clear to me where the ARPA moniker originated. I'd have to go back in my papers and look at that. But that said, I don't think the governor's vision is hard to communicate. He wants to invest in capital investments, basically. And I take your point that if you characterize this as a COVID-19 response bill, those capital investments are directly responsive to the emergency because they facilitate the things that have been missing for so many people in the emergency, the ability to telecommute, telework, telehealth, education. That said, one of the very interesting evolutions that I'm seeing in our discussion is a concept that Holly was talking about yesterday, which is how the conversation around universality is changing. I would have said just a couple of weeks ago that if you're aiming for universal broadband, you are talking about infrastructure. You've got to provide universal access. You've got to string poles and wires. But her point and the point of the Evelyns and others is, well, and Senator Brock's as well, is if you're going to have genuinely universal access, then people have to be able to afford it. People have to be able to get the gear and so forth. And so affordability has become, a called out element now of universality. I remember having an exchange with Senator Pearson last fall, where he was going back and forth in his deliberations about what to do in putting money toward subsidies when we know that the money's going to go away. And he was wondering, is the money better put into infrastructure or subsidies? And Senator, if I'm misquoting you, you'll have to jump in. And I remember saying back to him that it's an excellent observation about the tension, and that at the end of the day, you've got to have the infrastructure out first before you can be worrying about access through whether it's affordability issues or gear and the like. So that is the governor's position, and I fully respect that people of good faith and reason will have other views. If I may just take a few more minutes here, Madam Chair, to discuss the impacts of both bills on the department, I'd appreciate that.
That most certainly.
Okay, so I gave a presentation in House Energy Technology of maybe too great length to make the point that the department has evolved over the last 20 years in the telecommunications division considerably. A fact that gets lost and that this legislature needs to be thinking about, though, is this. When the VTA was decommissioned in 2014, the legislature set up a special division within the Agency of Administration. They called that the Connectivity Division, and it had a director and 6 full-time exempt positions. A year later, the legislature decided to make changes again and moved that Connectivity Division over to the department. It did not move the director position and 6 full-time exempts over. Instead, it sent us 3 full-time exempt positions and no funding. And the condition was that we could have those personnel if there were positions available in the position pool. And I will tell you right now that those positions in the position pool, my understanding at least, is they're very scarce to come by. So the House bill at least makes provision for reimbursing the department for the expenses it would incur in administering the transition away from the broadband responsibilities in the department to the Vermont Community Broadband Authority. But money alone is not enough. We need bodies. My staff is tapped out. We are straining to get work done. I hope we're doing as well as we possibly can. But this is a significant task that's envisioned in doing this transition work, and we need administrative help to do that. So if you're going to do that, please give us money and bodies. Secondly, in standing up the new entity, I think it's very important that you plan for those entities to have their own staff. Please do not be planning on taking or lifting out a staffing component from the department and putting that into the new entity, because the department needs the staff it has to do the work it will be doing apart from connectivity, apart from broadband. We have regulatory responsibilities like advocacy before the PUC on telecommunications matters. The incentive regulation plan for Consolidated, for instance, comes to mind. And we have advocacy that we need to be doing at the Federal Communications Commission that we are constantly struggling to keep up with because we just don't have enough manpower to get all these things done. So you are looking at standing up a separate entity with new bodies, not using the bodies that are at the department. And there's a tension there because, to be clear, the governor does not favor expanding government. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to cut off. We will have the commissioner back, I'm sure, before this is over. But I want to give the committee a 15-minute break because we've been at this for a while, and I have a full agenda here of CUD. So I hope that we aren't inconveniencing anyone too much, but I'm going to give us a break until 3:15, and then we can come back and start in with the testimony from the CUDs. And then tomorrow, we will take it up again. Senator McDonald, unless it's a yes or no, I'm trying to get everyone on break.
I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the thought that June Tierney put into her testimony today, and it looked to the future instead of looking backwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And hopefully we can all do that, looking to the future. Okay, thank you, everyone. Be back here 3:15.